In this video, we will explain what the moon symbolizes when it's in the 5th house. And in order to make it clearer in the end, and also to give you a better intuition for the nuances of it, we'll begin that by explaining what the 5th house itself is. Here's a visual that lets you see exactly what the 5th house literally is. It's the sky that's below the ground, but on the western border of that section. That is the basis for what it symbolizes. The undergroundness of the 5th house makes it symbolize internal things, and the westness of the 5th house makes it symbolize other people. So it symbolizes the way that our internal being interacts with the external world and other people. So that means two things basically. One is the way we interact with the world, and the other is the way we empathize with or digest the world. And this is why the 5th house is the house of intelligence, because intelligence is the ability to make sense out of the data that comes into your mind from the external world. And the 5th house is also the house of compassion. The things that are happening to the other people, you can relate to that. You can bring it in and make it a part of yourself. That's compassion. That's the nature of the 5th house. And it's the house of love, because that's the basis of love. Love means caring about other people. The 5th is also the house of communication, the ability to utilize languages and symbols to express our inner feelings and our inner concepts to other people. The 5th house is the house of expression, creativity, and art, because that's exactly what expression and art is. It's communication. And the 5th is the house of children, because what higher form of creativity and expression is there than to produce another living being? Now that we know what the 5th house is, let's quickly review what the moon is. Then we'll be really well equipped to interpret the moon in the 5th house. The moon is a very bright planet, yet it's only bright at night. Because it embodies these two opposites in one thing, being both bright and dark, it symbolizes fluctuation or change, fluidity, cyclicity. Because it's bright, it signifies being very attractive, being beautiful, attracting the eye. And because it's nighty, it signifies unseen things or private things. Because it's unseen, it signifies the internal things. The internal part of the self is the mind. The mind is the tool for perceiving emotions. Emotions are reactions to desires. The outcome of our desires produces emotions. Desires are reactions to our opinions. So the moon symbolizes our opinions and subjectivity itself. And the moon, being an internal and beautiful symbol, therefore symbolizes femininity, and being a bright symbol signifies authority or power. And combining the two, femininity with authority, the moon symbolizes the maternal figure, the matriarch, the mother. Now, to understand the moon in the 5th house, it's not so difficult now. So all we have to do is call to mind the things about the 5th house that have something very obvious to do with something about the moon. So for example, the moon represents mother, and the 5th house represents children. So that's something that's going to be very key to focus on, to understand and intuit and get a very rich picture of what the moon in the 5th house represents. Another example is that the moon represents the mind, and the 5th house is basically about the mind because it's about the intellect, which is a portion of the mind. And the third thing is that the moon is feminine, and the 5th house is loving and compassionate, which is a feminine asset. So if we're very familiar with how symbology works, we might keep it at just these 3 points. And that would give us a lot of unspecified but intuitive understanding of what the moon symbolizes in the 5th house. But let's spell it out a little bit more to help you get used to how to use symbolism. So for example, the fact that the moon is the mother and the 5th house is children, that indicates that the moon in the 5th house represents something in Sanskrit called Suputra. Suputra basically means you are a good parent. You get along well with children. But it also means you're a good creator, because put means to put or to express. So you're a good creator, you're a good expresser. So there's an artistic slant to it as well. On the topic of the moon being the mind and the fifth house being the intellect, in Sanskrit we would call this Sumedha. Sumedha means you have a good essence. Your internal is good. You have a good heart. You have a good intellect. Your focus, your concentration is good. Your imagination is good. Concentration is good. And then on the topic of the moon being feminine and the fifth house being compassionate, in Sanskrit we would call this Mriduga, which means your way of behaving is very gentle, elegant, soft, affectionate. Or Amatya. People who have the moon in the fifth house feel more relatable to more people. They feel familiar and therefore they feel trustable. Now, in my small database of maybe 20 or 30 well-known people with verified birth times, there's an awful lot of people who have the moon in the fifth house. And this is because it's a very desirable placement. It's a very synergistic placement. You can see there's no real clashes between the moon and the fifth house, and so it tends to help people become very successful. So who has the moon in the fifth house in my small database of people? Barack Obama and Donald Trump. And what does that really exemplify about the moon in the fifth house? It represents the principle of femininity and compassion together, making an Amatya person, a person who's relatable. Donald Trump, Barack Obama, especially Donald Trump, is very, very relatable to the common person. Barack Obama felt very, very trustworthy. The differences between these people, of course, are based on the differences in the rest of their chart and the different things that affect their moon in the fifth house. Another group of people, there's a lot of artists. Pablo Picasso, Charles Bukowski, Steven Spielberg, Ernest Hemingway, Stephen King, Helen Keller. Very expressive people, very creative people. What is this all about? Suputra. Good creator, very good at expressing. Sumedha. Good imagination, good creativity. And then one more name, which is particularly interesting in how kind of disturbing it is to find on this list. Ted Bundy. What the hell is Ted Bundy, a serial rapist, murderer, doing on this list? The moon in the fifth house. Is he also Amatya, like Donald Trump and Barack Obama? Is he also has his feminine compassion resonance, making him very relatable, familiar, trustable? Unfortunately, yes. That was how he was able to accomplish the horrific things that he accomplished. But as I said, the differences between these people are all due to the different conditions in the rest of the chart, besides the fact that they have the moon in the fifth house. So why don't we take a close look at Ted Bundy's chart to figure out what makes him so different than the rest of these. So here's Ted Bundy's birth chart, verified birth time, and he is complaining, of course, that we are calling him falsely trustworthy. But the evidence of him definitely being falsely trustworthy is very obvious in this chart. Look at his moon in the fifth house. It's with Mars conjoined Ketu. If you're familiar with astrology at all, that is a huge red flag on 2 points. Just to have the moon near, very near to a node is a red flag. But to have it very near a node with a malefic is a big red flag. And this moon is very close to the sun with Ketu and Mars, which means that his moon in the fifth house, fine, he's got the moon in the fifth house, so he's very feminine, good looking, relatable. But it's right after an eclipse with Mars, the violent planet. Now, I recently released a new Nakshatra report, which is now available. You can get it for your own birth chart. It's on my website, victorcara.com. If we use the information that report gives to take a look at Ted Bundy's nakshatras, it will also explain why he, although has the moon in the 5th house, supposed to be a nice person, isn't a nice person. This report tallies up his prominence of nakshatras, and we find out that Jyeshta is overwhelmingly the most prominent nakshatra, followed by Anuradha and Pushya, meaning that he's going to use the qualities of Anuradha and Pushya, which are very loving, affectionate, feminine appearing. Those are going to be utilized by Jyeshta, which is very selfish. The report also tallies up the nakshatra types. Ted Bundy has an extreme dominance of the Tikshna type. Tikshna is the type that is very volatile and very kind of cutting. And then the report also tallies up the pairs of the types into 3 groups, which are basically masculine, feminine, and dexterous. So as you can see, he has an extreme predominance of masculinity. So that's the context in which the moon in the 5th house exists for this person. This report, by the way, also gives you interpretations per planet in Nakshatra. The things that it says about Ted Bundy are very interesting. The moon in Jyeshta, all about intrigues, subterfuge. Mars in Jyeshta, a strategist and an opportunist. Now, he doesn't just have the moon in Jyeshta, and he doesn't just have Mars in Jyeshta. He has moon and Mars in Jyeshta. Plus Ketu in Jyeshta, subterfuge, misdirection, lying, overthrowing, taking advantage of other people. On top of this deadly trio in Jyeshta, he has the sun in Anuradha. The sun in Anuradha is not very great for romantic relationships. So that sets the tone for all of his intrigue and espionage and opportunism. Furthermore, he has Saturn in Pushya, which means that he's at odds with those who establish what's right and wrong. He's at odds with the law. Rahu in Rohini. Put Rahu in Rohini and the sun in Anuradha. Rahu in Rohini basically is the same thing. It's like a difficulty controlling your passion, difficulty controlling your arousal, intense compulsion for romance or sexuality. That's fine if you just have Rahu in Rohini, but if you have Rahu in Rohini and the sun in Anuradha and Saturn in Pushya, it's trouble. On top of all this is Jupiter in Swati. Jupiter and Swati, in the same chart that Saturn is in Pushya, they both indicate the same thing: being distant from the law, being at odds with the lawgivers. So this really explains why you can on one hand have Barack Obama with the moon in the 5th house, and on the other hand have Ted Bundy or Donald Trump or Helen Keller. All sorts of different people can have one placement be the same, because the rest of their chart may be completely different, and even the rest of the things about their moon may be completely different. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much.